Kiersten, ready to go?
Yep, I was just going to ask, Davis, are you ready to start?
Yep, absolutely. Let's go ahead.
Okay, Davis, I'll turn it over to you to start.
All right, thanks. Well, everybody, thank you for joining. I just wanted to kind of set the expectations about CRI. They are a wonderful NGO that does a lot of work around cyber readiness, and they are the Cyber Readiness Institute. And Microsoft has partnered with them because we do have a deep concern about our security, your security, customers' information, and so forth. So when they approached us about their programs that they have, their free offerings to small, medium-sized businesses, we wanted to take advantage and just make sure that everyone was aware of these opportunities for you. I do want to stress, though, that participation in this is voluntary. It's not a requirement to do business with Microsoft. But again, we thought that this was some valuable information, and we wanted to make sure that it got out to everyone as quickly as possible. So I'll turn this over to CRI to take us through the presentation.
Thanks very much, Davis, and thanks very much to all of you for joining. As Davis mentioned, we're the Cyber Readiness Institute, and this was a nonprofit effort that was started in July of 2017. And the initial catalyst for it was the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity, which was an independent bipartisan commission under President Obama. I served as the executive director of that commission, and Peter Lee, who runs R&D for Microsoft, was one of the commissioners, as well as Samuel Palmisano, the retired CEO of IBM, and Ajay Banga, the CEO of MasterCard. And we came together to launch this effort specifically looking at small and medium-sized business cyber readiness. And the idea with the CEOs of these large companies now, Satya Nadella, your CEO, is a founding co-chair, volunteered to come together to say we as global enterprises need to do more to help and support small and medium-sized businesses in our supply chain and our value chain. So the mission of CRI is to convene senior leaders of global companies and their value chain partners, all of you, from across sectors to share best practices and develop content and tools to improve the cyber readiness of these enterprises in order to secure global value chains. And as I mentioned, this effort was launched with MasterCard, with Microsoft, with the retired CEO of IBM, who now runs a nonprofit called the Center for Global Enterprise, and also the former Secretary of Commerce and now Chair of PSP Partners, Penny Pritzker. And since our launch, we've also been able to engage companies including Maersk, ExxonMobil, Citi, General Motors. And we spent the first year really working on a program. And what we want to do today is to walk through our effort. And we have a network, as we've got laid out here, members and champions that both help us to create content, but also to distribute the content. And we're going to talk a little bit further about that. I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Craig Moss, to talk through our approach. And then Craig and I are going to facilitate a conversation around our approach to cyber readiness for small businesses. We see this as a dialogue, so please don't hesitate to interrupt us. There is the chat that where you can ask us questions. There's a Q&A, but also just feel free to speak up as we go through this. Our objective here is to educate you on the program and to get your feedback on what it is and how it can work, and to be able to support you. Craig is a director of content for CRI with extensive background in organizational and change management and intellectual property. And he and I, as I mentioned, will go through this, but please don't hesitate to talk with us and to ask questions as we go along. Craig, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kiersten. And the other thing to mention is that we're happy to make this deck available to you after. So for any of you that would like that, just send us a note and we can send it out to you. So the approach that we took was to simplify and demystify cyber security. And we actually thought about it, let's think about it in terms of cyber readiness. And cyber readiness really is looking at what do you do to prevent the most common things from happening? And what would you do if you had an incident? So we wanted to demystify, and we focused on 4 specific areas. The research that we got from Microsoft and other companies said, if you really focus and help companies get better at 4 things, it's going to reduce their risk by a significant margin. And those four things, we'll go into a little more detail on them later, but authentication and passwords, patching, meaning keeping your software updated, phishing, which is probably the one we're most familiar with, and then the use of USBs and removable media. The way that we went at this was to think about preventative measures. And as I said before, what do you do if something happens? You know, we all know if there are buildings on fire or what to do. We know to be able to judge, is it just a small fire in the trash can, or is the whole wing of the building on fire? How do we react to that? Cyber, it's not that way. Most people have no idea what to do in their organization. We wanted to create the idea of a cyber-ready culture. And too often we look at organizations and what they've done is they've actually created a workaround culture because the pendulum swings from low awareness of cyber readiness and security to a really rigid approach to it. And you find that people just do a lot of workarounds. We want to keep it practical as much as possible. And keeping it practical is how you avoid the workaround culture and create that cyber-ready culture. And we built a self-guided program called the Cyber Readiness Program, which we're going to give you some more background on. We also developed a starter kit, which we'll give you a little bit of background on too. A key around this during the program is the idea of establishing a cyber leader in each organization. And we'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute too.
Thanks, Craig. So one of the elements here that you all know that we really focus on is the idea that there is third-party risk in supply chains, that a company in and of itself, securing itself, does not prevent the vulnerabilities of the interdependencies. There are many analogies to interdependencies in today's environment. Obviously, the Internet of Things is one of the greatest sort of individual interface, but it really highlights the fact that there is no company that works on its own, that every company is working with other vendors, with other entities to execute. And this is just an example of an article that talked about how a billing vendor was actually part of the vulnerability for the Quest Diagnostic breach that happened earlier this year. We see plenty of examples of this. And so when our members and co-chairs come together, it's to discuss how can they help their partners and also just raise the awareness of this third-party risk and how do we create an environment that supports the third parties in recognizing their responsibility and also doing more to be secure and to be ready so that there is a baseline level of cybersecurity. So as Craig talked about, our approach to this was to focus on 4 issues that are very easy to understand from a non-technical perspective. As Craig referenced, we talk about creating a culture of security. Cybersecurity is no longer, as you all know, the responsibility of an IT department. Every individual in an organization has a responsibility and an accountability for the cybersecurity of their own engagement and action. Everybody has a smartphone, everybody has a laptop, so there are individual efforts that can be taken, which then contribute to the overall security of the organization. And so what we focused on were those 4 issues that don't require technical expertise, that each individual can actually have an impact on. So authentication, we talk about the stronger authentication, strengthening a password. In patching, about updates and how to follow the update guidance. Phishing, as Craig mentioned, is probably what we know most about, and there's the most individual education around not just what phishing is, but what to look out for. And USB use, which is to minimize USB use, but also to offer policies and approaches when removable media devices are needed, if there is a lot of field work and other entities. Obviously, the baseline policy here would be not to use them, but we try to approach it in a way that doesn't create such a rigid policy that employees look and seek out workarounds. And again, so these are the 4 issues that we focused on and we built the program around, and we're going to go in a moment into the details of the program. But the idea here is to create a culture of readiness that relies on the individual and human behavior, not on technology, not on the procurement of resources through money. We also, what we're adamant about in this approach is minimizing financial recommendations. In other words, you should buy this in order to be more cyber secure. You should have more products, technologies, et cetera. What we focus on is the environment, the infrastructure, the human infrastructure that the business already has, and how to invest in the workforce in that infrastructure. So the real expenditure here is in information exchange and in the individual, in the employee, in the human, which ultimately then invests in the overall enterprise and environment. Craig's now going to talk through some of the statistics around many of these I'm sure you're familiar with, but it's just important to hammer home what we're talking about with these 4 issues. Craig?
Yep, thanks. And, one of the things that, before we dive into the stats here, for all of you to keep in mind is that even in the most sophisticated companies now, they understand that cybersecurity is orchestrating people, process, and technology. And you have to really have those 3 pieces in place. And we really very much focus on the people and process side to supplement whatever technology that your organizations may have in place. When we look at these stats, and these are some things that, are great ways to share inside your organization, because it gets people thinking about things. So on the authentication, I'm just going to highlight the bottom one because it's a great one. People always get a kick out of. 17% of people use their favorite sports team in the current year as their password. So if you put yourself in the hacker's shoes, it's really easy to go in and hack somebody from a geographic standpoint. They pick a company, they know the company is located in Pittsburgh, they say Steelers 2019, and they start running through that. They're going to get somebody that used that as the password. And the same thing is true in city after city around the United States. So that's one on the authentication that I find is really interesting. And it's something that will help get people thinking in your organization. On the patching, the key thing to think about here is that when a company like Microsoft releases a security update or a patch, you see it, we see it, but the hackers see it. And the minute the hackers see that, they are then trying to find companies that have not patched it and take advantage of that vulnerability to penetrate into your system. And it might not be, the end game might not be penetrating your system. They might be using you to get at somebody else or to get at somebody like Quest Diagnostics. So that's the other thing to keep in mind is the speed with which you employ patches is an important issue. Phishing is the one that's most heard of now. And it's really commonly, I'm going to highlight the bottom one here. 81% of companies that fell for a phishing attack lost customers. So from a small, mid-sized business standpoint, losing customers can be a critical, debilitating event. So that's another thing to communicate to your employees. They can lose business for your company through not paying attention to the emails that they're getting. And then finally, USBs. And here, a lot of people over the years pick up USBs at trade shows and they pop them in their computer. It might not be the booth you got the USB from that had put malware on it. It could have come right out of the factory with malware on it. So USB use is something that really does need to be minimized or eliminated as much as possible. We all know they're immensely useful little devices, but they carry a lot of danger with them. So these are just some stats that we do to try to get people thinking. And as you communicate into your companies, communicate with some key things that are going to resonate with people. Kiersten?
Thank you, Craig. So now we're going to talk to you about the Cyber Readiness Program. So as I mentioned, we spent the first year of the Cyber Readiness Institute building out this program. And we launched it, we built it out over last year. We piloted it with 19 companies around the world. And then we launched it in December of last year. And we've spent 2019 distributing this for free to as many small businesses as possible. And just to repeat and reiterate, the objective here is to create a self-guided, accessible program that will help your company become more cyber ready. And we're going to walk through what that is. I'll also share, if you log on to our website, either now or afterward, the website is www.cyberreadinessinstitute.org. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can sign in and you can follow along with what we're talking about here. But the 5 stages start with get started, and we're going to flesh each of these out, so I won't go into too much detail here, but it is a sequential 5-stage program that starts with identifying an individual, helping you prioritizing your assets, your mission, creating this culture and getting the commitment within the culture, rolling it out, and then measuring the program. And as I said, we're going to flesh out each of these elements. So stage 1 is get started. And what really is the point of distinction for our program is we talk about identifying a cyber readiness leader. This is not somebody that you go out and hire. This is somebody who already exists within your organization and who has the emotional intelligence about how to create cultural change in your organization. The analogy that I make is when we post 9/11, we talked a lot about the need to focus more on physical security in organizations. While that's not critical to the mission of an organization, it was certainly critical to the viability of an organization. And so what you saw was typically heads of human resource departments, general counsels, finance, being responsible for the physical safety of the organization, having an evacuation plan, having an emergency response plan. So we're talking about something similar for cybersecurity, identifying somebody within your organization who is responsible for creating this cultural change for cyber readiness. And as Craig talked about with the people, processes, and technology, we see it as really a pyramid where the people are the foundation. And you have to, they are the ones that make the difference in the security. Processes and policies help people become more secure, and technologies can help those processes work more efficiently. But at the end of the day, it's the people who are the most responsible and at the foundation. So when you go online, what we do is we provide these 4 elements under this stage, and we give you guidance on how to select your cyber readiness leader, what are the qualities you should be looking for within your organization, and then once that individual is identified, we offer them tips on how to be a good cyber readiness leader, how to create that cultural change and create that impact within your organization. And because this type of effort obviously needs not just bottom-up effort, but top-down, we outline a template for an agreement between the senior executive, the CEO, the founder, or whomever, and the cyber leader. What's important about this program is that we really are focusing on small businesses from 2 employees all the way up to 200, up to 1,000. In our pilot program, we had a company that was 2 employees and we had a company that was 1,000. We're really focusing on probably the 2 to 500, but it can certainly, it's not so much a size as really how it's handled cybersecurity up to this point. And so we use a term like CEO to impact that it's the senior executive, but sometimes we hear, well, you know, some small companies have founders or they use other words, but the idea here is that you're getting the agreement between the senior leadership and the individual whom you've identified to really take this forward.
And for the cyber leader, as Kiersten mentioned, they don't need to have technical background. During our pilot program, some of the best cyber leaders were people from the HR department. And the other thing, though, is you got to remember, it's not a full-time job, but it has to be a formal designation. The person needs to know that they've been given the authority to do certain things, and to be that authority has to be acknowledged in the organization, that so-and-so, Joe, has just been made the cyber leader. So with that, that's why we have that little symbolic step of having them sign an agreement with the senior leader. And it just creates a little bit more formality. The amount of time that goes into it varies significantly. Some of the leaders said that they would be spending as little as an hour a week on this over a couple-month period. It really depends on the size and complexity of your organization, but it is not anywhere close to a full-time or even like a heavy part-time job. It can be a very light amount of time, but it should be a structured role.
Thank you, Craig.
So the next step that we go into here is to assess and prioritize. And this really is to give you or the leader some background on those 4 issues. 1, so that you as the leader have a little bit more understanding. But 2, so you can start to communicate to others about these issues so that they, again, I'll use the word demystify, so that you kind of demystify these things for them and use clear language that they're familiar with. We also suggest here that in the program that you do a baseline measurement. And these are really simple questions about, what's the level of awareness in your organization? Do you have a policy on this issue? Very simple things, but it establishes a baseline for you. The next piece is really important, and we put together a really simple way for you to prioritize what are the most important things to your organization. What's the most important data? What are the most important systems to your organization? Because you can't protect everything equally well. So prioritization is one of the important steps so that you know what is more important to protect. And the example I'll use here is if you have your grandmother's sentimental high value diamond ring, you don't leave it in a jar in a bowl by the door with your car keys. However, if you have a bunch of costume jewelry and you have a teenage daughter that wants to grab some earrings to run out the door, you might very well leave a bowl of costume jewelry earrings by the keys so she can grab a pair on the way out the door. We intuitively understand in other issues that we can't protect everything equally well. A lot of organizations don't understand it when it comes to cyber readiness and what they're trying to protect. So we try to create a very simple way to get people thinking about what is more important to protect. Kiersten, anything you want to add on that one?
I think the other aspect to this, and I think all of you know this, but in this world, this evolution of where we are with technology, data arguably is the most critical asset. And so regardless of what the mission is of an organization, whether you produce a widget, whether it's a service, the data that you collect becomes a critical asset. And so what we're trying to do in this effort and in this program is to be able to help you understand how to prioritize the efforts, the functions that are critical to your mission, but also understanding the role of data. I do just want to make a quick note. I saw that there was a question about making this deck available and it being recorded. I apologize that we didn't mention this at the outset. We are recording this session and we can make it available, and we will be providing the presentation to attendees afterward per request.
Just one quick thing before we go on. And the other thing that we didn't mention about there is the idea of going to the cloud. And different organizations are at different stages of evolving to the cloud. And we do provide some guidance on that. That's an area that we're seeking more input from companies on, as to what is easier to move. I think by now most people at least have their email is hosted in the cloud. But when you get to things like their accounting systems, there's a lot of resistance to that. And so that's an area that we do provide a little guidance on, but it's an area that we all want to learn together about. Where does it make sense, and what would be the evolution and the order of which you would move things to the cloud.
And one other point on that before we go to stage 3 is the guidance that we offer is where you have direct interface to a network, to the internet. Those are the easiest things initially to move to the cloud, as Craig said, like email, web service provision. When you get into legacy systems like accounting, like payroll, those are more challenging. And so those, from a sequence perspective, a company likely won't choose to do those initially. You want to sequence it out so that effort, resources, et cetera, are allocated effectively. So stage 3 is actually part of the core of what we're doing, which is we provide policy templates on the 4 issues. And the intention of these templates are to be, or these policies are to be simple, practical, accessible. I could walk up to anybody on the street and explain to them what these policies are. So in passwords and authentication, we talk about what a strong password looks like. From a software update perspective, we talk about the need to follow the update notices. Again, it's important to remember that these are not the 100% solutions. These are the 80% solutions that create that foundation of security upon which you can build to be more secure. But if you do these basics, if you take these basic policies and build off of them, you've created that foundation. And then you can have more technical policies, grow off of them to be more specific to your organization itself. But we've mentioned a little bit, we've referenced the types of policies, but we create these templates which typically have 3 to 4 tips and guidelines on what the policies look like. And we ask then the cyber readiness leader to work with their organization to customize them for the organization. We also provide a template for an incident response plan. And the overarching effort that we've outlined here is about preventing what can be prevented, and that's what the policies are intended to do. But then recognizing that a breach or an event is likely to occur, or an incident, it's how do you minimize the disruption from the event? How do you create a resilient culture so that when something does happen, you minimize the disruption and you ensure that operations are up and running either continuously or as soon as possible. Ultimately, an organization wants to get to a point where a breach does not have to be a demonstration of failure, but arguably a demonstration of success, in that how it is handled recognizes and demonstrates what the organization has done to be strong, resilient, and to be prepared. So it's a little bit of the Titanic analogy, which is you don't need to be in this place where you think you're never going to sink. If you've got the right number of lifeboats and life preservers, then when something does happen, you're able to continue to move on. There are all sorts of analogies that you hear people use, but the idea that breaches should not be disruptive ultimately, and that you can handle them in a way to minimize the disruption so you don't contribute. There are various statistics that we see in small businesses, which is, 6 months after a breach, X% of small businesses go out of business. You don't want that to be a statistic. We want to work with small businesses to get to the place that we help you prevent what can be prevented, but then you're prepared when something does happen. Craig, anything else on that?
Yeah. One point I think that's important for all of you to understand, and if you haven't thought about it this way, it's important to do so. When you think about cybersecurity, there's really the data loss side of it. So what would happen if I lost my data where you couldn't access it anymore? Or what if that data went public? So that's one side to it. What are you trying to do? You're trying to prevent that from happening. You don't want to lose it, and you don't want to not be able to use it. But the other side is business continuity. So what happens if your website goes down for a week? What happens then? So you think about, with these and with your incident response, think about the data loss, but also the business continuity. If you're a really small law firm, for example, and your website goes down for a week, it's not a big deal typically. Whereas if you lost a lot of client information, it's a really big deal. If you're an e-com company and your website goes down for a week, it's a really big deal, because every hour it's not up, you're losing sales. So that's another way for you to think about it that I think is important for all of you in your companies to think about, that data loss and business continuity sides to what you're trying to protect.
Thanks, Craig. Do you want to walk through stage 4?
Sure. So once the policies have been agreed to, and you use our templates and get some input, we always talk about getting cross-functional input, which in a big company, that means going to different departments. In a small company, it might be going to your partner in the company, but talking through it to make sure that they're practical. So those get approved. The next stage is really to communicate, to roll it out inside your organization. So we have a communication kit here. We actually have collateral materials that you can use. An announcement, we have posters, we have really cool pictures, actually from Egypt. A company sent us in pictures of the posters up on the wall in their coffee room. So posters that you can use on each of the issues and the importance of cyber readiness. We have email templates that you can use to send out as reminders inside your organization. We have training material template that you can use. You might want to customize it a little bit, but by and large, it's there to help you communicate the importance of cyber readiness, why it matters to your business, and some of the basic things that they need to do to get with the program. And then following through with the idea of a little bit of formality helps a lot. Is we also advocate that you have the employees sign a workforce cyber readiness pledge. And we have a template in there for that. Very simple, it's probably like a half a page. It basically says that, hey, they listened, they are going to do their best to try to create a cyber ready culture, and they're going to do their best to participate in creating that culture. Again, that little bit of formality gets people feeling like they're more part of a team. As Kiersten mentioned before, we do a lot of work on change management, and that's part of what we're trying to accomplish here is getting people to all feel that they're part of the solution and that they have a role in the solution. And that little bit of formality is helpful. And then you can do whatever you want around that. You could have, the employee of the month, all the other things that people use to recognize employee behavior are all can be used and come into play in trying to build a cyber ready culture.
Thanks, Craig. The other point that I want to emphasize is since we launched this in December, but even since we started focusing on these issues, which was back in 2017, there is an evolution of understanding which very much aligns with our approach, which is really focusing on human behavior. For a long time, we saw cybersecurity solutions occurring from technology with technical solutions and not really looking at the individual as much. One of the issues that we confronted with the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity was this tension between moving security away from the end user, which is very much of a technical approach and focus, and educating the end user. And ultimately where we came was this recognition that you do both. There's a hybrid solution. Where you can, you want to move security away from the end user, take it out of the end user's hand. But we've now created such an interdependent digital economy, digital culture, that you don't want ignorant users. And so what we're really focusing on here is this human behavior piece, as we've said in different ways. But I do think what's important is if you start to look at other efforts, so the Department of Homeland Security Supply Chain Task Force that's being run out of DHS as well as with the White House and run by industry has just developed a new workforce stream that's focused on human behavior. DHS has also invested in a human behavior campaign. It's one example of what we're talking about, but it continues to encapsulate what we're focused on, which is the element that human behavior is actually at the foundation of security, which is an evolution of thinking from where we've been. Solution security are not going to rest only in the technology. The other piece to this is that when you do invest in technology, having an educated workforce will increase your return on investment. A technology is only as good as the technology itself, but if you have educated users using it, then you have the better opportunity for a greater return on that security that you've invested in with the technology by having an educated workforce.
I think that's really an important point that you bring up, Kiersten. And for the companies that are listening in, I think that's really part of the role now of a cyber leader. And it's understanding how you integrate or orchestrate technology and people together to do this. And for example, something like two-factor authentication, we advocate that it should be turned on whenever available. So when people first start doing that, there's typically pushback. People in the company are going to say, oh, that's really inconvenient. Well, you have to find that balance there. Another quick story I'll tell is like on USB use. There was one company that we were working with that originally had anybody could use a USB, And then they had a breach that was really USB was the root cause. Malware was inserted, and they had a breach through that. So then they swung the entire other way and said, nobody can use a USB. We went in to start to look at the organization and their cyber readiness, and we found that the field engineers, this was like a mid-size, small to mid-size, maybe 500 people, their field engineers were routinely getting USBs with drawings and specs from potential clients against company policy and bringing them back and plugging them into their computers to get the drawings off so they could bid on the projects. Clearly a violation of the policy. We went to IT and said, do you realize that that's what's happening here? IT said, no, we had no idea. So we went back to the engineers and said, did IT ever give you an alternative to using USBs from clients? No. Did you ever explain to IT why you have to use USBs? And they said no. So it really was a communication issue. And we were then able to help them solve the problem by having IT set up a non-networked computer that still let the field engineers come back with a USB, hand it to IT, IT would put it in the non-network computer, get the data off it they needed, and they solved the problem that way because an alternative was provided. There's a case where the business imperative, those field engineers are trying to do their job, but the policy that was put in place, all for good intent, was prohibiting them from doing it, and they created a workaround culture. And once that happens, every other person in the company starts to think, well, if they can do it, we can do it. So that's why we really want you to be thinking about practical application in your company and taking those policy templates that we provide and really thinking through it for a couple, not for a little bit, and just saying, would this work here? Or what would we need to do to change it to make it work here, given the role of the people in our organization and what they need to accomplish to help our business?
Thanks, Craig. And so what stage 5 is, this is the last stage, is we give you the same metric, qualitative questions that we offered up in stage 2, so that you can determine what your improvement is through the program. And this obviously is important because if you're going to invest the time and the resources in something, you want to know that it makes a difference. And when you have finished the program, we provide a certificate of completion. And so what this certificate of completion does, we had one of our key members from Microsoft share that if someone's going to take the time to go through this program, they're going to want to have a demonstration to others that they've done this, that they've taken the time and the effort to do this, and this is what they've done. Craig, can I ask you, because Craig works on all the analytics, what is the high impact number? I think it's 79% of all users of the program have identified that it has had a high impact on their cyber readiness, but I'll leave that.
Yeah, it's 77% have said that it had a high or very high impact on their cyber readiness at the end of going through the 5 stages.
And this is obviously very important to us, and we're continuing to work through this. We see this program as a dynamic program, one in which we're constantly taking feedback and incorporating it. I'll give you an example. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their recommendation for passwords is a 64-character password. It doesn't have to have characters or numbers. It can just be a sentence. It could be a sentence about your favorite sports team in your city, but the idea is that it doesn't have to have that. So that was our initial recommendation. What we have learned from many small businesses is that a lot of the programs or other activities that are being used don't have enough space for 64 characters. So we're in the process of revising that to be more suited toward what small businesses are using. And so that type of feedback is incredibly helpful to us. Craig also cited the USB feedback. But we are looking at this as a dynamic educational loop where we're taking feedback from all of you, from small businesses that are parts of broader value chains, that are independent efforts, because in this digital economy, every entity is part of a global value chain in some way, shape, or form, and working to improve this program so that it is accessible, it is usable, it's practical, and it's effective. for small businesses.
And
Yep.
the other thing that we do in that last stage is we have you remeasure. And that's an important aspect too, because in stage 2, you answer some very simple questions about, level of awareness, things like that. If you come back and answer them again in stage 5, you'll be able to see the progress that you've made. And that's an important aspect also, because we want you to celebrate the success that you have in getting more cyber ready. And that's something also that helps to create that culture, is to go back to the CEO or the leader of your company, or go back to the workforce and say, hey, 2 months ago, only 18% of the people here knew had a good password, or knew that we had a password policy. Now we're up to 80%. Those are the types of things that really make a difference in starting to build up that culture. So we focused on 4 simple issues, and we really then focus on trying to embed those 4 into the culture of your company.
Thanks, Craig. And so, as I mentioned, we spent the time building out the program. 2019 is about the distribution of the program. So by the end of the year, we will touch over 1 million small businesses in Europe, the Americas, Asia, and the Middle East. And what's important here is that this is a global effort. This is not US focused. Obviously, a lot of our test runs have been in the United States because we're based here, but our membership is global, and we're working very diligently in getting more small business representation. The program is currently translated into Spanish and Portuguese. So if you go online, you can actually look under languages and you see the full program translated into those. Key components of the program are translated into Japanese and Arabic, and we're currently working on full translations into Chinese and French by the end of the year. And as we've shared, this is a free program. It's validated for stakeholders, and we're encouraging our partners to share it broadly. We showed that slide quickly at the outset around all of the partners with whom we're working. The other point that I will make, because it's been made a couple times, is this a case of you get what you pay for? In other words, if it's free, how valuable is it? And I'll make another analogy, which is to financial aid. Financial aid is about individuals receiving the benevolence of those who have more resources available to them, but to get the same level of awareness, education, et cetera. We're convening global companies with the resources that have come together to make this free so that we can get it out to as many small businesses as possible. Because what we know is that cybersecurity for small businesses is a distinct discipline. To take a final analogy, it's a little bit like pediatric medicine. For a long time, we told small businesses that we just needed to shrink down the best practices from large companies within their sector, and that would work. We now know that small business cybersecurity is a distinct discipline, and the efforts for small businesses are different than the efforts for big businesses, regardless of sectors. And that small businesses have more in common with small businesses across sectors than they do with the big companies in their own. And so that's why we have really focused on that distinct discipline of small business cybersecurity in order to create this program and to continue to improve upon it. So what we ask you to do now is to go on to our website to register for the program. As we've said, it's free. And to check out the starter kit. And the starter kit you'll see on the banner at the top of the website, that is a distillation of the program itself. So if the program itself just is not something you're interested in engaging in immediately, although as we said, we've tried to make it very simple and straightforward, check out the starter kit. It provides some of the elements of the program itself in a very easy to access kind of one-stop shop. And it's really intended to kind of get you warmed up to what the program can be and to show different efforts. Before we close out and make final comments and open it up for additional questions, Craig, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, just one thing before we take questions is that the other thing that we're working on now is, although the program's self-guided, we're expanding the user support part of it. So along with that, we are starting now. So if you start the program, you're going to get a certain automated email, welcoming you. We're going to be sending you automated tips along the way to try to help you. And we will be scheduling webinars on specific stages or topics so that you would be able to join. You would know that there's a webinar coming up on authentication or a webinar coming up on, communication to the workforce. that we would announce to all the registered people as a way to try to help you through the program. So although it's self-guided, we are also expanding the way that we can support you through that self-guided process.
Thanks, Craig. And just to confirm, so this is our website address. I'll leave this up. And we really appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you. We're very interested in your feedback, either obviously through the remaining time here or through emails, and we'll provide all of that information as you go on to the website and go through the program and identify what's relevant to you or recommendations for revisions or change. But before we close out, obviously we've got time for questions, and I would love to hear any questions or feedback that any of you may have.
You can just type them into the chat or the Q&A. Either function, I think, will get it to us.
One of the other elements, while we're getting some typing, that's been very important that we're looking at into the future, and we would be curious to get some of your feedback, is if there would be value in taking a program like this and evolving it into an accreditation. So if you said something like you became part of, you took the Cyber Readiness, you did the Cyber Readiness Program, you had a certificate, what that would mean, and would that be something that you would then find value in investing in? I see that there's a program, is there a cost associated with using the program? And there's no cost. The idea here is that it's the investment in your workforce. The cost is time, and it's the additional time of an individual to become the cyber readiness leader and to work with the team and with the enterprise. But Craig, anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, just nothing that you have to buy from us, and nor is there anything that we're planning to sell you in the future. So it's really there, thanks to the generous support of Microsoft and MasterCard and others. It's really there for you to take advantage of.
I see another question about when the presentation will be available, and would someone from our organization be willing to review an entity's security policy and procedures? We'll send this presentation to Davis Harding immediately following this, and then he can distribute it to the participants. And yes, please reach out to us. In that email, I'll also have both Craig's and my email address, so you can reach out to us and then we'll follow up with you. Another question is, have we started working on cloud app security? The individual, Jesse Marshall, is sharing, I think it's the next area for time and money to be spent, and interested in the accreditation, which I appreciate. So cloud app security, Craig, do you want to start that and then I can add on, or I'm happy to initiate?
You start and then I'll...
Okay, so we have not worked on cloud app security. It's something that we're actually looking to work closely with Microsoft on, obviously given its expertise and its background. I think the cloud piece is something that's very interesting, because when we first started the program, when the CEOs and the senior leaders from these large companies came together, the initial recommendation was, well, shouldn't you just recommend to all small businesses that they should go to the cloud? And then we stepped back from that to say, well, first you've really got to educate companies on their security. This is the human behavior piece. And so what we're looking at is, what is the most effective and easy to understand guidance on cloud? And we're in the process, as I shared, of working with Microsoft on that. Craig, anything else you'd like to add to that?
Just that, to your point about the human resistance, what we found is that certain departments or certain people in companies were more reluctant to move things to the cloud than others. And part of it then is an education with them is, well, why do you think it's less risky, or that you have less control, or whatever the case may be. So I think it is sort of an evolution there about getting people to think about it a little differently.
That's great. Question is, do we have any specifics on security concerns with Azure versus AWS? So while Microsoft is one of our co-chairs, what we are focusing on is being vendor agnostic. And so we have not gotten into anything around cloud providers. What we're hoping to be able to provide is overall guidance, and then allowing entities identify the appropriate cloud security provider. And that's important to us to keep that, so that we can help companies go through their own guidance and go through their own steps in understanding that. I do think, and this is, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but in light of the Cap 1 breach and the challenge with AWS, I think that it does require a conversation around putting functionalities into the cloud does not absolve you of the responsibility. That's something we were saying anyway, but I think it's an important effort, which is just because you've given something, you've outsourced it, does not absolve you of the responsibility to have oversight and to keep tabs on it. And that's something that we're going to want to hammer home, certainly as we go through this.
And Kiersten, to that point, the other thing that we see with small and mid-sized companies is that